We are here today to talk about the U.S. judiciary. And to be clear, we are here today because we in Illinois have some power through our senior senator, Dick Durbin, to do something about our judiciary. So the purpose of this call is to understand what we need to do about our judiciary and to call folks to action to put pressure on Senator Durbin to take some of these steps. Indivisible, Illinois is seeking a meeting with Durbin. The more people who speak to him, who call him or send him messages about these issues, better a chance we will have of having some pressure on him. We're going to talk about why the judiciary is important in our government. I'm sure we all have some ideas about that. We'll just review that. And we're going to talk about the kinds of problems we're having right now with our judiciary, how they're dismantling some rights, how some of the things they're doing are undermining our democracy, how our political processes are interfering with judicial nominations. We've seen ethics problems in our judiciary. We've seen some bias, and we're going to talk about what can be done about it, both in the Senate, in legislation, and if necessary, in constitutional amendments. And we're going to ask you to help. So, to review, our judiciary interprets our Constitution, they review our laws, and they're a check on the power of the other branches of governments. Our judiciary can declare laws and executive actions unconstitutional to ensure that our government doesn't become overbearing in some manner. The judiciary, in general, settles disputes between individuals. Of course, people have a problem, they can sue. They have civil cases. There are criminal cases as well. And of course, the lower levels of the judiciary ensure that those parts of the law are enforced properly. Many of those suits are involved in protecting our rights, our individual rights, minority rights. The judiciary is the safeguard of the rights. I mean, we have rights under our Constitution, but in many cases, the only way to enforce those rights is to bring suit and call the judiciary to enforce them. The judiciary can enforce the rights of minority groups, sure their rights are not overridden by a majority, overbearing government action. Our judiciary is necessary to ensure due process so that we're all equal under the law. That's a principle of our Constitution, a principle of our government, that we all should be equal under the law, and we depend upon our judiciary to make sure that happens. And the judiciary is intended to provide some continuity and some constancy in how our laws are implemented. And that is generally done through precedent. When a major precedent is set, it is meant to endure. And it should be very rare that a major precedent is overturned, which is essentially a revolution in how our laws are interpreted. So precedent is very important to the continuity of the way we enforce our laws. And we've seen some problems with our judiciary for the last few years. We've seen that machinations in the Senate have pushed our judiciary extremely far to the right. And that judiciary has actually been dismantling some of our federal rights, most notably for women to control their own bodies and their own reproductive rights. That's an example of a long-standing precedent that is being overturned, and they're using fairly radical jurisprudence to overturn these things. We've seen some fairly radical jurisprudence in the area of legislation regarding gun rights. They're starting to say, unless a law is rooted in the historical governing of our country, that it may not stand. So, for example, when we say that someone who's a spousal abuser may not have a gun, it's possible the court will say, well, that's not historically accurate for our country. Historically, there was no prohibition against abuse of men owning guns. So that's the kind of radical jurisprudence I'm talking about, which can cause precedents to be overturned that aren't good for our country, just aren't good for our country. So, and one of the problems with the Supreme Court's view of returning rights to the state is that in many cases, the states aren't democratic anymore because of things the Supreme Court has done. Political gerrymandering is the primary example. When the Supreme Court allows political gerrymandering, that can cause a state legislature to not really be representative of the people of the state. And let's take reproductive rights as an example, and we'll talk about our neighbors to the north. Now, in Wisconsin, at the state level, the state is purple. Oftentimes, Democrats win. Democrats won the governor. They have one senator. They just won a Supreme Court case, Supreme Court position on the liberal side, and they did lose one senator. So they have one Democratic, one Republican senator. It's really purple state where, in many cases, the blue party can win at statewide elections. So it's close. But in the legislature, it's not close at all. In the legislature is deeply red due to the way the state has been gerrymandered. So when the Supreme Court returns rights to the state, and the state is undemocratic, the Wisconsin legislature is not going to implement reproductive rights the way the average citizen in Wisconsin would like, because the state legislature is not representing the average voter in Wisconsin. This pushing of the court to the right and the excuse of just returning rights to the states really undermines our rights when the Supreme Court also supports processes and policies that destroy democracy. Now let's talk about how judicial nominations are handled. The administration nominates judges for the federal bench. The Senate has to approve them, and there are Senate rules that can cause senators to have a lot of control over the kind of judges that are in their state or in their circuit, their multi-state circuit court. We all know how the Senate just decided they just weren't going to consider Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court. That is one of the kinds of things I'm talking about. But the other thing that happens is there's this tradition in the Senate called a blue slip. A blue slip is where any senator can block a judicial nominee slated for his state or slated for the circuit, the appellate circuit in which his state is a member. And that's not even a Senate rule. It's just a tradition. And what that causes is it causes the judiciary in different states to become biased. The blue senators in blue states will approve more liberal judges and perhaps block more conservative judges that might be brought forth. The opposite is true in the red states, where senators in the red states will block a more liberal judge and approve a more conservative judge. So you'll find that the rule of law is implemented differently in different states. And in fact, there are some judicial districts where there's only one federal judge. And this enables jurisdiction shopping, where if you want to bring a case, you can bring it in this jurisdiction because there's a judge in there that was chosen by a bunch of senators that lean this way or that, and you're going to get a decision this way or that. That process means we're not all equal under the law. It means that in one state, the law is more biased in one direction. In another state, the law is more biased in another. And that really doesn't help our country, We've also seen some problem with ethics these days, with judicial ethics on the Supreme Court. And in fact, I will say that the ethics difficulties we see occur on both sides of the court. They might be more overt in one side or another, but we still see some ethical problems on the blue side as well as on the red side. What we're seeing here is a court that feels like they can act with impunity. They can overturn precedents. They can ignore judicial standards. They can ignore issues of ethics, while ethical standards are required by law for lower federal courts, for federal appellate courts. We don't have a law on the books to require ethics at the level of Supreme Court. And the things that are required at the lower levels in the federal and the appellate courts, the Supreme Court justices are just ignoring them. They're not self-implementing these ethical laws for themselves. And judiciary, most important thing judiciary has is the confidence of the population that we all will obey the court when the court says do this. A state government will obey the court when the court says do this. And that's just because we all recognize the court is fair and legitimate. And when the court acts in a way that doesn't seem fair, when a court acts in a way that seems unethical, that damages the standing of the court in our country, and that damages how our democracy works. So we've all seen that the way the nomination process has been handled, especially at the highest level, that the Supreme Court has been pushed very far to the right. They're taking very extreme steps. They're using radical jurisprudence to overturn precedents that have been longstanding, and political bias has really been built in to the Supreme Court at this point. And we do need to consider steps that can be taken to return balance to this court. It's not particularly popular, it's not particularly easy, but we need to at least be willing to discuss what could be done. Now, when you think about how a democracy is supposed to work, if a democracy works, then the will of the majority must rule within whatever constitutional limits you have. We have a Bill of Rights. The majority cannot override a person's rights. But within the Bill of Rights, the majority has to win, and the majority has to be able to implement their policies. It's not enough to win an election. We run on a platform saying we will do this, that, or the other. And the people vote for the platform, and the politicians running the platform wins, and they have to then be able to implement this, that, and the other, whatever they are. And if a politician can win and it's impossible for them to implement the policies that they ran on, then you can't really say your democracy works very well. We have a Democratic presidency, democratically controlled Senate, and still, with all that, we can't get the judiciary to be where we need it to be. And the same thing is true on both sides. If the conservatives win an election, they ought to be able to implement their policies. If the Democrats win an election, they ought to be able to implement their policies. And if your democracy doesn't result in elections making a difference, your democracy is broken, frankly. All right, so how do we make progress here? Well, in most cases, progress can only be made by Congress. But some of Congress actions are easier than others. There are rules in the Senate which the Senate can change just by a majority vote. Well, maybe not. Maybe a change to Senate rule can be filibustered. Maybe not. Not quite clear on that. But at least you don't have to pass legislation to change a Senate rule. You don't have to get the House involved. Now, the other thing you can pass legislation. That requires both the House and the Senate and the president to approve. Some of the things we need to do might require legislation. Some of the things we need to do might require a constitutional amendment, and that gets to be very, very hard. So let's see what kind of things we really should be talking about here to fix the problems with our judiciary. First of all, the blue slip process I mentioned is one of the first things we need to pay attention to, because that's the way that senators can cause the judiciary in their state and in their circuit to be biased in one way or another. And it's just a Senate rule. It doesn't require legislation. So one of the things we need to impress upon our Senator Durbin, who is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who can act to try and change this and just get rid of this tradition where any senator can just say, no, you can't do that, is to get rid of the blue slip. We use the phrase pink slip the blue slip is one of the things we want to see Senator Durbin take up. Then there's the issue of ethics. As I mentioned, there is legislation on the books to require level of ethics disclosure, specifics about recusal when there might be a conflict of interest for the lower levels of the federal court, for the federal bench and for the appellate courts. We need to implement that kind of legislation for the Supreme Court as well, because they're not doing it on their own. Now, yes, this is harder because it has to pass both houses. The Senate can't do it by itself, but we need to build momentum for this. We need the Senate can help build momentum for this by holding public hearings. And if we have to subpoena Supreme Court justices to appear in these public hearings, we can certainly Supreme Court legal experts, constitutional law experts, Supreme Court law experts to testify in this area. We need to subpoena the court justices as well. And they may refuse. They may claim, oh, we're independent from you guys, which isn't really true. Congress has the authority to pass legislation that controls how the judiciary works, including the Supreme Court. And once again, we need Senator Durbin's Judicial Committee to hold these hearings, that make this stuff clear to the public that these steps, this kind of legislation needs to be passed. And of course, we have a lot of problems in the legislature right now. It wouldn't be the first thing in anybody's mind. We have to deal with the budget. We have to deal with international issues. But the legislature will become working at some point, if only after the next election. And we need to start to build public support for ethic legislation that applies to the Supreme Court. Now comes the issue of restoring balance to the court. This is a tough issue because some people will say, oh, you just can't pack the court. You just can't add more people. The other side will just add more people. But let me say, there's nothing magic about the number 9. The original court had 13 justices, 13 because there was one from each original state in the Union. So I think that we at least have to discuss the possibility of doing something here. And the thing that sounds good to me, we have 12 circuits, 12 areas of the nation made up of multiple states. And it could very well be that we should mimic what the founders did. The founders said, let's have one judge from each state. I'm suggesting one judge from each judicial circuit. Now, that is 12, and that means there'd be a tie. Well, so you fix that by giving the Supreme Justice, the Chief Justice, 2 votes, and that way the Chief Justice could break a tie. It's kind of what we have in the Senate, where you got 100 senators. You could easily have 50-50 tie in the Senate. So we give the VP the tiebreaker vote. Now this doesn't require a constitutional amendment. This can be done with legislation. Once again, it would have to get through the House. It would have to get through both parties. Would have to support this, but we at least should be talking about it. We at least should be understanding that the court is out of whack, and we can use this process to restore balance to the court. Now, another thing that gets a lot of attention is term limits. And we need to discuss this. The idea that we can have 9 folks or 12 folks or whatever number of folks that are on there forever until they decide to retire or until they die, it means it's very difficult to plan succession. I mean, if a justice doesn't want to retire and then he dies, all of a sudden, it's you have no way of planning for that succession. Whereas if there were specific term limits, then we would know when somebody's coming off. We could be ready to talk about who's going to take his place. And we wouldn't have, once again, if we have some bias built in, term limits are a way to help ease that as we move some folks out and bring some new folks in. And I think we're the only modern country that says our judges on the Supreme Court are there for life. Everybody else has got term limits on this kind of thing. Now, some people think this would require a constitutional amendment, but I'm not so sure, because if you look at what our Constitution says, it says federal judges serve for life unless they're crooks. And it doesn't say they stay in the same position for life. And federal judges don't stay in the same position. They start out as judges in one state. They can move up to the appellate court covering multiple states in their area. They can move up to the Supreme Court. But there's no reason that we couldn't make another higher court, which is advisory. It's a research court. It's a court where they kind of go to retire. They're still judges. They still get paid, but we move them out. We move them. We say, hey, after 18 years or something, you move to this other court. And we have a precedent like that on the appellate court. If you're an appellate judge and you get to where you really want to retire, you can move to a voluntary appellate bench where they don't assign you cases. You can take a case if you want one, but you don't have to take a case. You're still a judge. You're still paid. You're there for life, but you're kind of in retirement. Well, we could set something like that up for the Supreme Court too. And that would be, I think, and there's a lot of legal types who've thought about this and think that that's constitutional. So that's another issue. Every one of these issues is a step further, and we want to start with the earlier ones, but we want to keep the other ones in mind and make it clear that we want to move to these areas eventually. So these are all things that I think we should be bringing to the attention of Senator Durbin, so he understands where we think we need to go to make our judiciary work for our nation. As I said, we have some power here. There's 50,000 people in Indivisible, Illinois. If a bunch of us start calling this guy and leaving him messages or sending him emails, he'll start to pay attention to us. And when the folks from the Indivisible Executive Board call up and say, our members are riled up about this. We need to talk to you about this stuff. We got a much better chance of getting a meeting with him and making it clear to him that we in Illinois want him to help with these issues, on issues with the blue slip, ethics issues, expanding the court, implementing term limits. We need to push on him. And so what I want you to do, this is my call to action. Call Senator Durbin. Start next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Call him every day. Leave a different message every day. Tell him on one day you want the blue slips gone. Leave a message the next day. We need to implement ethics legislation. You need to hold hearings about this. Implement the next day. Tell them we must consider expanding the court to restore balance. The next day, call them and say we have to consider how we can implement term limits. And if we get enough of our people, if you get your family members, your friends to make these calls next week, then we will be putting pressure on him that he just can't ignore. And this has worked in other states. It's worked with Schumer in New York. This is the kind of way that Indivisible Illinois can exercise power. We need you all. The other thing I will say, that's my call to action for you. I'm just about done. I'm ready to take questions. I will say one other thing. Next week, same time, same station, I'm doing another presentation, which is even more important than this one, that I want you all to come to. That's about our democracy. Now, we see right-wing populism in many countries, but it's worse here. It's worse here than in any country. And next week, I'm going to tell you why it's worse here. I'm going to tell you how our Constitution is enabling it to be worse and what we need to do about it. So this week, I'm asking you to make a bunch of phone calls, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And then Thursday night, please come back. And I'll talk to you about what we need to do in the long run to help truly restore our democracy.